Good morning. I guess we'll go ahead and get started. It is 10:45 and we only have 45 minutes to work with here. My name is Pete Filicetti. I'm a principal consultant with Kingsman Technology Solutions. We're a DC-based company that provides federal solutions around Office 365 and SharePoint. I'm a former Microsoft guy, still bleed blue, but left a couple of years ago to go out and do something a little bit different and work with some different customers. So these are the session objectives and takeaways. The primary things that we want to do are provide an introduction to Microsoft Graph, the capabilities and how you would use it for development. We'll go over some of the various options that you have for development. No way we can touch on all of them. Microsoft has done a great job of providing the ability to work with the graph from a variety of platforms. We'll pick a couple. The demos that I have are an ASP.NET MVC application, and an Angular 4 application, but we'll go through everything else that's covered with Graph that way. We'll talk about authentication, not a real deep dive, but just an overview of how authentication works when you're working with the Graph. And we'll go through some of the demos just to show how things interact. And we'll use the Graph Explorer to show how you would build your requests, what the responses would look like, and how that translates to what you're building into your actual applications. Session takeaways, one of the biggest ones for all of us that have been working with this a long time, back when it became Office 365 APIs and things started to come together, is we now have a single endpoint that we can work against for all of the different workloads and data. Again, several options for graph development, and we'll go through what those are, but we'll touch on the demos from a couple. And that Graph leverages Azure AD and app registration. As part of the demo, we're going to go through and do the app registration, set that up, and hopefully nobody's back there taking pictures of my codes and then going through and using the app registrations that I put up. So not that it would hurt anything. So this next picture is a little bit almost overwhelming of everything that you have access to with Graph. Groups, calendar, files, meaning your OneDrive or OneDrive for Business, messages and meetings, so Outlook Exchange for your calendar items, your mail items, users, profile photos. The demo that we're going to go through is going to work with a profile picture, and it's also going to work with sending an email on behalf of a user. So what this is going to kind of touch on is all of the different things that you have, but really how it gets implemented in a business application is up to just your own imagination, your own requirements. We'll touch a little bit on the insights, which is kind of where you start looking at trending items. I'm glad that I actually brought up my own stuff because I had a bunch of stupid things that are trending within my own company that I don't want to show everyone. So we'll use a sample account that they provide in the Graph Explorer for that. And like I said, we'll touch on calendars and files with the demos that we're going to do. So the initial implementation that Graph has replaced worked with a lot of different services. And if you were trying to build an application that would span OneDrive and Exchange, the biggest issue that you had is you had to have multiple access tokens. And if you were going to try and bridge across what happened between those two services, you had to do all of that in code. And that was a real pain in the neck. There was also a lot of issues when you worked across the different platforms that your APIs were different. There wasn't a lot of consistency between the two, and trying to figure out the differences and why things worked or why they would break when things were republished was a real challenge. And a lot of the things that you'll see with the Graph API that we have now solves a lot of those issues. So if you were working with users, you would work with Azure AD Graph, which was great, but again, highly volatile, and it had the same inherent issues that you had, that you couldn't work with the same access token across multiple services. With Mail, Calendar, and Contacts, that was handled by Exchange or Exchange Web Services if you've worked with those. OneDrive and OneDrive for Business, OneNote. But again, the biggest issue is that if you were going to talk to OneNote and you were going to talk to Exchange, you'd have to have a separate token for each of those. They couldn't be shared. So you were continually going out and getting those tokens instead of having a single one that could be used across all the services. And again, the last one was a big one. The APIs continually changed, which was creating a lot of headaches when you'd write your code and then something would change on the back end. This is what we have now, and this is really one of the biggest advances that we've made is that bottom section with the graph.microsoft.com, which is your core URL for getting to the Graph APIs. And I hope that that's clear for everyone. But you can see all of the data and workloads that you have access to now. And on top of that, your authorization and authentication levels are handled with OpenID Connect and OAuth 2.0. And then at the development environment level, I'm just going to touch on the Visual Studio and the Visual Studio Code. There's actually a lot more in there. We're going to be in the Angular demo using Hello.js for getting our access token. So the development environment, there are a lot more options in that level, but there's no way to fit it all on a slide to be able to do that. And then at the top, you have your choices of technology between .NET, JavaScript, plain old HTML. You can host things on Azure or other platforms as well. So this is kind of the big selling point slide for Graph. And the biggest thing, it probably should be point number 1 and not 4, is a unified REST API. And as you work across the various levels, and we'll show those in the Graph Explorer, everything kind of remains consistent, whether you're dealing with OneNote or whether you're dealing with Exchange messages. It's very consistent. So writing the code, you're not continually trying to guess what your URLs and your HTTP requests need to look like. The resource IDs and endpoints are very, very consistent. Second point, the single token, and you'll see in the code, we're going to get a single access token, and then we'll work with OneDrive, or we'll work with calendar events, or we'll send an email. That's all done with a single access token. So when I run this application, it'll ask me to log in. Once we have that access token, it continues to work with that throughout. We don't have to continually go out and log in again over and over again. The consistent property and naming schemes, again, makes writing the code much easier, and we'll jump into that with the demos. And the versioned endpoints. Right now, there's a v1.0 and a beta. There are more going to be coming, but you can select the specific version that you want to work with right through the HTTP request. At a high level, the development overview, it's going to use your standard HTTP verbs, get, post, patch, put, and delete. All HTTP requests have to be authenticated. So when we get that access token, that gets passed with each request that we make via HTTP to the Microsoft Graph. And I'm going to jump out of slides. This URL here at the bottom has the metadata, so you can provide in brackets there, instead of version, we would put v1.0 or beta to go out and pull down all of the metadata for the Graph API. So I'm going to jump out and do that. So this is an entire dump of everything that you have access to through the version 1.0 Microsoft Graph API. And you'd spend a lot of time reading through this. And what I'll show you is that when we get into the actual Graph Explorer, sometimes looking at the actual responses and seeing what's coming back from the API is a much quicker route to what you want to get done than reading through all this. But this does give you the full description of everything that the API provides. Everything you can see from enumeration values to the parameters that are expected. So this is just one option for looking at what's in the specific versions. And if we swapped out version 1.0 for beta, if you were so inclined, you could look at the deltas between the two to see what's supported in the beta version. And of course, when new versions are released, you could put that in place of beta. But this is just going to give you all of the information about the API as a whole. I don't know how useful it is, but it is an option. So this is the request pattern for making a request, an HTTP request to the Graph API. So you'll see that first one is a version. Again, we have v1.0 and beta right now. And then the resource would be something like me, or if you were working with users and wanted to reference a specific user or an organization, those aliases for me and my organization, those are going to apply to the logged in user that's running the application. So we'll see that when we run the Graph Explorer, that when I use me and pull up my profile, that it's going to pull up my profile picture. And then a lot of these should look familiar, the OData query parameters. And we'll use one of those as an example, like a select or an order by, to filter the results that are going to come back, especially on a get, so that we're not pulling back a bunch of extraneous data. These are the platforms that are supported, and on the dev.office.com Microsoft site, they actually have quick starts for all of these. So you can select a specific platform you're working with and pull down a quick start application to get you going toward development with any of these. And we're going to work with an ASP.NET MVC application today and an Angular in the demos that we have. So when you're working with a Microsoft Graph application, we're going to be working with Azure AD as our authentication auth flow, and that handles an OpenID Connect. And when we run through the demo, you'll see that it's going to come up and prompt me to actually go through and authorize the application to run. And this is going to apply whether we're working with Exchange, SharePoint. I don't have a demo that works with Yammer or OneNote, so we're going to touch on a few of those. And this applies whether you're working with device apps, like a phone, whether it's a website, which is what we're going to be using today, a single page app, or service applications. There's a wide variety, but they all work with that single auth flow through Office 365. There are two types of consent, an admin and an end user consent, that I'll show you in the next slide, kind of the differences between the two. And that's what's going to allow applications to run across an enterprise or for very specific users. The protocol, again, is OpenID Connect with OAuth 2.0. One of the very nice things, especially with all of the breaches that have been going on, we don't capture user credentials when we have an application. Once it's been authorized, there's no more information that needs to pass. But the nice thing is we're not storing anybody's username and password, no credentials. That's not our responsibility, so we don't have to worry about data protection for that. And the fine-grained access scopes, your application will ask for what it needs to do. And I'll show you that in the demo. So it might be for OneDrive that it needs to be able to read and write files. Or for your calendar, it needs to be able to read events or send emails. There's a very fine set of access scopes that your application can ask for, which makes it so, I don't know if you've ever installed an app that wants everything under the sun, wants access to everything. So we have the ability to ask for just what we need in these applications, and users can decide if that's acceptable to them before they run it. And it does support multi-factor authentication and federated sign-in. And the long-term access is nice because every time you come in, you don't want to have to re-authenticate with an application to get it to run. So the refresh tokens allow for long-term authentication. And I promise I'm not going to kill you guys with slides. I do have a bunch of code to show you, but I just got to get this stuff out of the way. So with consent, two types, admin consent and end user consent. Admin consent is when an Office 365 admin provides consent for an application, and it's only available to Office 365 administrators. And when they give it, it's given to all users in an organization or an enterprise. End user consent is what you're going to see me do in the demos today. That's where I'm giving specific consent to an application to access my profile or send email on my behalf. Any user in the organization can install and run the application, and that's by default, but an Office 365 administrator can turn that off if that doesn't fit within the guidelines of the specific organization. So now I'm going to finish up with this slide, and we'll go out and look at the Graph Explorer. The Graph Explorer is something that anybody can go out and access, sign in with any account, and go through and work with this. It's a browser-based implementation that Microsoft provides for free. That's the URL for it. And the way it works is there's some canned buttons you can click that'll generate the HTTP request, and you can see the request that was sent and the response that came back. This implementation handles all the authentication. We're going to go ahead and go through and log that. And the nice thing about it is there's no installation. It's nice for exploring and getting an idea of what's being returned in a specific request, and you don't have to build an app to actually use it. But one of the other advantages to it is, so we saw in the metadata all that information coming back. And if you didn't know, say for example, when you're pulling back events, what attributes are coming back in that JSON response, you could use this Graph Explorer to see what comes back and then modify your code accordingly. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to take one of the demos and expand what comes back by using the Graph Explorer to determine what's coming back and what's available to us. Is that readable or no? No? Okay. So right now this is a standard, when you go to the Graph Explorer, this is the account, they're using a dummy account for this, and we can actually click that sign in with Microsoft button there to sign in with my account, which is what I'll do, and that way we can pull back some other meaningful information. One of the things you'll see at the top next to the get is v1.0. You can change that to the beta version, so you can work with both APIs, the v1.0 or the beta version, by just changing that drop-down. So what I just clicked was the Get My Profile. Is that readable? Okay. And what you can see is this is the JSON response that came back for the dummy user that they're providing through the Graph Explorer. And we have a bunch of information that came back, standard stuff, display name, given name, title. But you can imagine where that would be a lot of information. Maybe you don't want to be pulling over the pipe. Maybe you want a little bit less information. So you can go up here to this URL and add a select. And let's say that the only thing that we cared about was the display name and the given name. So all I did was at the end there, added that select so that we'll only pull back those attributes. And then when I run the query, I forgot the dollar. You can see that it just pulled back that data that we're interested in. And that's going to save some of your bandwidth, especially if, for example, you're pulling back calendar events and there's 700-800 of them that are coming back, and it's going to pull back all of the information with that. If you only care about a couple attributes from that, you can use that select. And this is just one example. This would be also where you might put an order by clause in when you're pulling back multiple items, or filters in there as well. The Get My Photo, that's not my photo, that's their user there. But you can see, again, the dollar value for the photo. This is their user's email. And again, a lot of it gets really long. So it may make sense if you're pulling back messages to only focus on a few attributes from that, because parent folder ID, conversation ID, you can see that over time that would be pulling back a lot of data. So you might want to filter some of that out. And this is the interesting one, the trending on the insights. And actually, let me go up to, so you see the URL. This is in the beta version. This is not in the v1.0. So you can see where it swapped out the version to beta. Everything that alias that has to do with my profile is going to be me, insights, and trending. And that's where, you know, I put in when I was logged in, and it had a bunch of stupid documents that are brought up that apparently there's strange things trending within my company. So we'll use the Microsoft account for that. And then the last one they have is the My Manager. See if, yeah, there's no photo for that person. Any questions about the Graph Explorer or what you can do with that? So either that was a really good demonstration or I'm boring you all to death. I can't tell which. All right. Well, at least I got a chuckle, so I guess I'm not boring everyone to death. And I'm not even going to jump back into the slide deck yet, because the next things are going to be the demonstrations around the code that we have to work with. So app registration, if you've ever worked with an application where you have a client ID and a client secret, that's essentially what we're going to be doing. I've pre-created some, but I'm going to create a new one so that you can see what happens when we actually do this. I'm trusting everyone not to go through and capture the client IDs that are shown here and use them, but again, I don't think it could actually hurt anything. So where you're going to start with this is apps.dev.microsoft, and it's, that's not, I want to use another account. So these are the applications that I've created, and they were for the demos that I have now that I've gone through and tested. But we're going to do a new one for the Angular app so that we can see what the whole process of the app asking for permissions and you granting those permissions look like. So to do that, you would start with add an app. And we'll just give it a name. The contact email is just what it sounds like. That's who Microsoft would send emails to. We're not going to go through the guided setup. So it has a name, and you see this application ID here. That's the application ID that I'm going to capture and use in the actual Angular application so that it knows that it's authorized to run. The only other thing we have to do is add a platform, and you have essentially the three options here, whether it's a web, native application, or web API. So we're using an Angular app, which would be web. And then the only other thing that we need is this redirect URL. So this is where it's going to come back to us, and we're going to run this from our local host, so we'll just provide that information here. We'll save that. And And I'm just going to capture this application ID off and stick it over here. And we'll come back to this when I run the actual Angular app. So at this point, let's start with the ASP.NET MVC application. And I won't drill down into every bit of code in this, but we'll just kind of go through an overview of what it provides. So let me run it first, show you what it does, and then I'll go through and we'll talk about the most salient parts of what the code has in it. So it's a very simple application. It has a button for getting email address. So what it's going to do is go out and pull down the email address, and then it's going to give us the option to send an email and to upload a profile picture to your OneDrive. So it's got a few different pieces in it. So I'm going to click Get Email Address, and you can see that it's going to ask me which account I want to work with, and I'm already signed in with my corporate account. And it came back and filled in my email address. And it pre-filled in some information if I want to send myself an email through this account. So I'm going to hit Send Email. And it's doing a couple things right now. It's grabbing my profile picture, uploading it to my OneDrive account to include a link to it, and it's sending the email. And very quietly down there, it just said, "Success, your email was sent." So if I come back over here, you can see that it sent the email from my application. It uploaded and provided a link to a photo in my OneDrive, and it also attached that. You can see that mypic.jpg up there, and then there's just some standard text that they put in here in the message. There's actually a lot that went on in this demo, because it went out and pulled down from my profile my email address, my photo, and then it used the Graph API as well to send an email and to upload a photo to my OneDrive. So it kind of gave you a few different services that you saw all with one button click, essentially, that we were able to accomplish. And this is what the code for that looks like. So this is a standard ASP.NET MVC application. Up here, these are the values that we were providing. So where we went out to apps.dev.microsoft.com, this is that client ID and the client secret, known as app ID and app secret. The redirect URI, we used 4200 for the one I created because that's an Angular one. The other apps that I created use the 55065, the standard ASP.NET MVC. And then down here, remember back when we were talking about fine-grained permissions, this is what this one needs. So user read means it wants to pull down information about a profile. Mail.send, sending an email. And then files read write, which is my OneDrive, where I gave it permission to upload that photo to my OneDrive. And this is where your app will ask for its very specific permissions. And again, this is the web config that we're in. So in the home controller, this is the method for get my email address. And what it's going to do at the beginning is get this access token. And you can see instance in front of this. We're using a singleton for this auth provider so that we're not creating multiple instances of this throughout the application. There's just a single auth provider. So we're always going to pull back that access token, and once it has one, it's always just going to provide that. It doesn't need to go out and authenticate over and over and over again. And we're going to use that access token to talk to OneDrive or to talk to Exchange to pull information down. And then we have this call to get my email address, and I'll show you that one quickly. So you see the endpoint that we're working with. The only thing that may change in that is if you wanted to use the beta instead of v1.0, but that's my profile. And then you see we added the select to just include mail and user principal name, because we don't need to return all that other stuff if all we want is somebody's email address. And then it's going to do some pretty standard stuff. Come down and create a client, and then it's going to create an HTTP request, and it's going to provide that endpoint that we were going out to, the Graph API, along with the access token, and then it's going to issue that request as an async call, and then just wait for the response. And we saw in the web form that it came back with my email address. And then the other slightly more complicated one is sending the email, but again, we saw this from the Graph Explorer, the photo value. This is where the code is pulling down my profile photo so that it can upload it to OneDrive to include the link to it in the email. This is the method that does the upload. And you can see, although it's cut off a little bit, it's the balancing act between being able to see the text and being able to see all of it. So the graph.microsoft.com is telling it this is the photo that we're going to be uploading. And you can see we were talking about HTTP verbs. This one's going to be a put for an upload to OneDrive. So the other ones are going to be a get when we're pulling information down. We have a put as well in here. And the last thing I'll show you from this one is this is the endpoint that we include in the email so that somebody can get out and find that photo that we uploaded to OneDrive with the link in there. So it's actually creating that based off the file ID from when we actually uploaded the photo. I understand with the short time I have to be quick with the demos. Are there any questions about the ASP.NET demo? So it would depend on the account that you're logged in with. Since I'm logged in with an Office 365 account, not my standard, like my Outlook account, this one's uploading it to a OneDrive for Business account. OneDrive for Business associated with my account. So it depends on what you're logged in with. If I logged in with my Outlook.com, it would upload it to OneDrive. Yes? So the me is actually when you're doing the send email is who it's from. So that maybe I didn't understand the question. Because the link that it created in the email, if you hover over it, oh, there's no way you can see that. Let me see if I can get it to, can you read that? So it actually, when we did that create link, it created a link to the photo and provided you the link to get to my OneDrive. So if I had granted you permission, then you'd be able to get to it. So that create link gives you the one that's actually going to be accessible to the outside. Okay, so let's jump over to the, and just to show that let me refresh this. So you can see here, it uploaded 8 minutes ago, that my pic. So it actually worked going to the OneDrive for Business. It uploaded that photo. It just overwrote the one that was there. The other thing in my OneDrive for Business is this demo file. So the Angular demo that we have is going to pull down my calendar events. And when we click Write to Excel, it's going to write them into this Excel document in my OneDrive for Business. I don't know how useful that is. It's just kind of a demo to show you how it can pull the information down and what it could be used for. So this one I'm using Visual Studio Code. This is the equivalent of the web config. We have a configuration.ts file, a TypeScript file. This has the app ID, and then the scope is what we need it to do. So this particular thing is going to be reading my calendar events and files.readWrite because it's going to be writing into that Excel spreadsheet that is in my OneDrive for Business. So let me just go ahead and run that. So npm start will issue the ng serve and go through and do the build and start listening on port 4200, which is what we had the redirect for. So at this point, it's listening on 4200. And I'm going to click login. And it knows that I'm already signed in with my corporate account. And it pulled down all of my information about the most recent events that would come through there. So a bunch of boring things, some lunch and some meetings I have to go to. And it pulled down the organizer email address with it because those are the two things that we asked for. So now when I click Write to Excel, it went through and it updated in Excel, in this Excel document here. Well, it was supposed to have. So let's pretend that everything works like it's supposed to in a demo, and what it would do is in these two columns it would write those events and the organizer email addresses. And I swear this worked this morning when I tested it, but let's look at the code a little bit and play around with it. How many people here write Angular applications? Okay, so this all probably makes sense to you. The basic things that we have that are important here, this is using hello.js for the access token. This is a very simple service that's implemented in here, and all it's doing is using hello to get the access token for the logged in user. 3 lines of code. This is the service itself, and you can see in here the important parts being the URL. So we're working with the v1.0 as opposed to the beta. This is the Excel spreadsheet and the table that was supposed to be updated in OneDrive for Business, that it lied and said it did. The Get client implementation is very simple. It's just calling that HTTP service to get the access token. And then it uses that to initialize a new client. Let me scroll again. The Get events implementation is starting with, you can see me/events. The .select is equivalent to our $select and putting in what we want to bring back. It's doing a get, and then it's returning those values. That's what got shown in that web page. And then down here, if it had worked, this is adding the events to Excel and then going through and using that URL, the me drive/root, to dump those events into the Excel spreadsheet. And again, I swear it works, but that's the way demos always go. So let's do something, I guess, a little bit more interesting. We see that it's returning subject and organizer email, so let's add a couple other fields. But what might be good is to go over to the Graph Explorer So when we look in here, here are all the things that come back that we know are available to us within the events. So we could go through and pick a couple, like maybe the start date and the location. And if we come back over to our code, in this select, we can just change this to include start and location. So right now it's pulling back subject and organizer. I added start and location. And now so that those actually show up, we can just take and add a couple more headers. For the start and the location. And we'll do the same thing down here. But we know that this is a JSON response, and those are actually containers. So let's go back over to Graph Explorer and take a look. So start, we can take and grab the date time out of that, and then the location, we can grab the display name, because those kind of have the meaningful information that we want to use from that. So we'll go back over to here. Now we can see, because NPM, we actually automatically compiled and redeployed this, you can see it added our start dates and our location. I'm not going to bother trying to write, well, maybe I'll write to Excel one more time. Just for the sheer torture of it. Oh, okay, so now it actually worked. So you can see that it actually was able to successfully write out the events and the organizer emails. I didn't actually add those other two columns that we just saw to what we were putting in Excel, but this gives you the demonstration that we can go through and not just upload files, but we can actually go through and manipulate them directly in OneDrive from code. So I think I have 2 minutes left and just a couple slides. So there's a few resources, and again, all the slide decks are going to be available from the TechDays website. But one of the ones that's a great starting point was that top one for Microsoft Graph. That's the one that I was telling you had the quick starts, where you could go through and pick the platform you were on, and it has a bunch of links to other applications that are actually in use in production sites. Sample code and applications are on the GitHub site. And there's also a dedicated area on Stack Overflow for things that are tagged with Microsoft Graph if you're starting development there and have any issues. So again, the session objectives, just to reiterate what we went through, we had a quick overview to Microsoft Graph and how this incarnation of it is a unified way for us to interact with everything from users to OneDrive for Business to calendar events. We talked a bit about authentication. That could be a whole session by itself, but again, the important thing to take out of that is that it's using OAuth 2.0 against Azure AD for authorization. We went through some demos, just a couple of the platforms, ASP.NET MVC and Angular. And the other thing we went through was app registration to show how you would go out and create an app. So just in case anybody's taking pictures, I'm going to go out and delete all those later, so you guys can't use my app IDs. But that's one of the steps that you have to go through for any apps that you create for this. And with 29 seconds to spare, that's all I have. Any questions? Yes? So Microsoft has a roadmap for just about everything related, so you can watch out there. I don't know if they actually push a notification for that, but you can watch. Or if you go out and check that Graph Explorer and all of a sudden There's a V1, a V2, and a beta, but I don't know if they have projected a date. There's a lot coming in 2017, but right now I don't know when it's coming out of beta. Yes? Yeah, let's do that one after. That was a lot of material, and I'm out there telling me I need to get my stuff off the stage. So let's do that one after. I can talk to you after. Okay. Thanks for coming. I appreciate it.